And I join Enrico and John in thanking you for being here and taking the time to be here. Needless to say, I was not elected president, in case you're confused. I'm looking at, I'm gauging ages here as to what your generational memory might be. But by way of illustrating what I want to talk about, and contrary to what Enrico says, I'm not going to speak for an hour. This is going to be a conversation, so what I have to say will be short, and then we'll have a discussion. I will give you a bit about my background because I think it does make the point I want to make. My older brother John Kennedy ran for president back in the 60s. I was a graduate student, working on a PhD in philosophy and religion, of all things. And all of a sudden, a young candidate for president challenged my generation to adopt an attitude of what I guess you would call idealism. And that's really what I want to make my remarks about today. Individual people, each of you, shares one thing in common with a society or a country. And that is, at least in almost every case, and at some time in your life, you have certain ideals. Quite often, for most of us, those ideals have to do with a career, education, career, making a living, starting a family, and so on and so forth. But as with the society, for people of your generation, people in a certain age group, there is often a spark or a sense that things can be better. That's kind of a shorthand way of describing what idealism is. I would define idealism as the gap between what is and what ought to be. And what fills that gap is a sense of idealism. For you as individuals, for each of us as individuals, that idealism makes us want to do better. Do better in school, do better with our lives, and quite often make a contribution to our society. Now that may be in a neighborhood, it may be in a city, it may be in our system in America, be in a state, or it may be on the national scene. But John Kennedy, and then after his untimely death, his brother Robert, challenged those of us who were young at that time, a little older, to have a sense of idealism. And if you have not seen a video, which the center here has, that was shown last night at the dinner, you should see it. Just 4 or 5 minutes of Robert Kennedy campaigning for president, and that's what he campaigned about. He said the United States of America can do better. And each individual kind of fills his blanks. But let's go back. It's odd for me to think about this, but let's go back 50 years, which is what it was. At that time, the United States had a very segregated society. In much of the United States, African Americans had to eat separately, travel separately, South had deep, deep poverty, not just among African Americans, but among white Americans as well. So it sounds as if his candidacy was a negative, but it wasn't. What he was teaching was, to my generation, was idealism. We can struggle to end poverty. We may not ever actually end it, but we should try. And that's the point about idealism. We have to try. He said the same thing about Vietnam. We can defend democracy around the world, but we don't have to go to war. And we don't have to lose a generation of young Americans in that effort. At that time, it was the beginning of the, I guess you would call it, feminist movement. But women, particularly young women, were demanding and insisting on equality and equal rights. And the environment became a big issue because we began to discover, after 100 years of industrialization in the United States, major corporations were dumping poison in the water and in the soil and in the air. And there was a famous incident called Love Canal in New York, where neighborhood people discovered their kids were getting sick, discovered barrels of very, very toxic stuff sitting very near the community water supply. And so they started a protest, and that was the beginning, in a way, of the environmental movement. So you have to go back to that period when I was a very young person, a little older than you, but not much, to see that ferment that was going on in America. And again, it was the difference between what Americans claim for our country, what we claim to believe, and what we actually did. And John Kennedy first and Robert Kennedy later said, we can close that gap. I don't think he ever believed, very realistic, that we could create a perfect country on earth. No, nobody could. But the sense of idealism is every person, particularly young people, ought to do everything they can to make their own life and their nation's life close the gap as much as possible. And that's really, I think, what this foundation and this center stands for. Each of you will have a career, and hopefully a very, very productive one. But Robert Kennedy would have challenged me, and I will in his place, to think about, at some point in your life, if not throughout your life, making a contribution, as I said, in your neighborhood, in your community, in your city, if you're in the United States, in your state, or in the nation. Just to complete my story, I changed from my graduate program because of the Kennedy program. Went to law school, graduated from law school. My first job, 1964. I know you can't believe I'm that old. Was at the United States Department of Justice in Washington when Robert Kennedy was Attorney General. He then, the next year, went to New York, ran for the Senate, became a United States Senator, and then ran for President in 1968. After he left the Department of Justice, I personally went to another federal department, Department of the Interior, because I was interested, being a Westerner, in the environment and all the environmental issues. And so I worked for a very great Secretary of the Interior, man called Stuart Udall from Arizona, on the preliminary air quality and water quality legislation in America in 65, 66. Back to Colorado, got involved in a presidential campaign in another one. 1972, for a man called George Montgomery, was campaigning also against the war in Vietnam. And George Montgomery actually, after our never having run for office, ran for the United States Senate, age of 36, and was very lucky to be elected. And so I served in that Senate from 1975, I get the dates wrong, ran in 74. Served from 75 to 87, was reelected in 80, needless to say. And I think John Rico said, had a chance to run for president myself in 84. And tried, in my campaign, to replicate what John Kennedy and Robert Kennedy had done to my generation. We had a press conference here yesterday with Terry Kennedy, and I mentioned the Kennedys used the image of a torch being passed. And they really believed that political leaders had an obligation not just to promote themselves, but to bring people like you into the process. Whether you become a political candidate or not is, of course, up to you. But there are a whole variety of ways of being of service and pursuing that idealism. The Kennedys, Robert Kennedy never said, my generation, run for office. They said, give something back. Public service, a sense of public service. And by the way, I think the period of time when you most strongly have that sense, if you're going to have it at all, is about your age, sometime between 17 and 25. After that, you get jobs, you get families, you get obligations, you get mortgages, and life overwhelms you, except for some of us who keep churning in that sea of idealism. But it is young people that have to keep that torch alive. I feel, as a presidential candidate, that I told three brief stories yesterday. One of the people who worked with me was a young man. He did advance work in the campaign, which means he went ahead and made all the preparations. Afterwards, he became a humanitarian. He is today in Ethiopia. He has spent 25 years with organizations such as Save the Children, and he's now a regional director of Save the Children in Murate. And I like to believe he was inspired toward that sense of idealism by just being involved in that campaign. A second young person went back to Massachusetts and created a program called City Year. And City Year is now back in 15 cities across America. Some of you may have heard of it. It began in Boston. And the program, based on private contributions, was to give young people, a lot of young minority people, but lower income, a job for a year or two, doing civic projects in the city in exchange for educational support benefits. Third was a young man named Bill Shore, who had worked in my Senate staff. And Bill Shore read an article after our campaign in 84 that talked about poverty and hunger in America. Bill Shore used his own credit card and began a program called Share Our Strength, SOS, and gradually began to raise money. Share Our Strength for the last 25 years has, I think, raised and contributed something like $200 or $250 million to end hunger for young people and for children in America and in other parts of the world. Did that just out of thin air, just idealism. So what this center stands for and what this program stands for, it's not just speaking truth to power, it is doing something about it. It is, and the people involved in this program are doing something about it. People that John described, others you'll find out about. So all I can say to you is I'm happy to have a chance